Here in the Sala dei Giganti, decorated by Giulio Romano, we have imagery that is related to a visit of Charles V to Mantua as he was touring through Italy. And we see that visit referenced here really specifically because the giants here are meant to represent two of the foes that Charles V was at that moment embroiled in various struggles with the Protestants and the Ottomans. And we see this same kind of imagery and those connections made in some of the ephemeral decoration that was put up for his various visits. And so we know that that's what this is about. Jupiter and the gods represent Charles V and his allies. And as you can see, as you look around the decoration of the room, the gods, of course, are successful in defeating the giants, and the walls that the giants have built are being destroyed. And you can see that as you work your way around the room with these columns that are falling over, and you've got these big giants that are falling over as well. And of course, there's a bit of sense of humor to it, as we've seen in the exterior of Palazzo del Te, and that, over the doorways, there's a real sense of the possibility of this falling in on you. And there's something over each of the doorways that's really meant to bring that kind of interactivity with the viewer to the fore. Here's yet another view. Giulio Romano was richly rewarded by his patron, who purchased a property and gave it to Giulio, and then Giulio redesigned the building using an architectural style that's obviously related to what he did at Palazzo del Te, thus recalling his role as the Duke's architect. He also collected he had a collection of ancient sculptures which were displayed here. And of course, there was quite a bit of fresco painting in the interior, some of which is still extant. And it is also of Jupiter, thus, underscoring these kind of connections between the Habsburgs, the Gonzagas, and then directly with Giulio. Habsburg Milan is a different kind of situation in a way, because in Milan, Milan was actually a duchy of the Spanish crown. And so the Habsburgs had absolute control over Milan, and put in sort of these short terms, there would be a governor that would come from Spain and, sort of supervise, watch over the city, and send reports back with frequency to the court. And it's in Habsburg Milan that we have some of the major figures, artistic figures that were working for the Habsburgs. Arms and armor were especially produced in Milan, and other sorts of metalwork, and those were very sought after by the Habsburgs and by other courts of Europe. And stationed in Milan was the man who became the chief sculptor of Charles V, Leone Leoni. We see Leone's self-portrait medal here. It is a fascinating medal because it has around the portrait of Leone is a series of chains and shackles, and in the background you can see an image of the papal galley, and then there's a hammer and a shackle that's been broken. And this medal refers to Leone's liberation from the papal galleys that he was sentenced to serve on for an indefinite amount of time after disfiguring the papal jeweler who had offended Leone. He was liberated by Andrea Doria when the galley happened to land in Genoa, and Doria had Leone do several works for him, and then it was through Doria's intervention that Leone came to the attention of Charles V, and that opened up a whole world of possibilities for Leone. Initially, Leone was asked to be the head of the imperial mint that was in Milan, so making the coins and medals for the Habsburgs. And then, through some of his own persistence, he was able to get some commissions to do larger scale sculptures. The bust of Emperor Charles V, is one of many portraits that Leone did for Charles. The Habsburgs really had a preference for portraits, and um, they used these in some of the same ways that the ancient emperors had, by having these representations of themselves throughout the dominion that they ruled over as a sort of reminder of their presence. This one, we don't really know where it was meant to go, but it was commissioned from Leone in 1549, and eventually it made its way to Spain. When Charles V abdicated his rule and imperial rule and decided to move to Spain, he set up his household there and ended up living the rest of his days in a monastery in Spain, and instead turned over the power of rulership over Spain and the Netherlands to his son Philip, who became Philip II, and then gave the other part of the empire to his brother Ferdinand. And the what happens with Leone's work is that he starts doing them in Milan, and the bronze work in particular that he does, he cast in Milan, and then they're transported by Leone's son Pompeo to the Spanish court, and Pompeo finishes the details of the statues, and then finally they're turned over and become part of the royal collection. This is another sculpture that Leone does, and it's part of this same series of commissions that he gets starting in 1549 directly from Charles V. It's a fascinating sculpture because there's really nothing like it else in the Renaissance. In fact, I don't know many other examples that are like it at all. But what we have here is a slightly over life-size standing figure of Charles V, who stands over this figure who's sort of contorted underneath Charles and represents fury. You can see the obvious connections between the composition here and with Cellini's Perseus figure that we've already looked at. And Leone was well aware of what Cellini had done. In fact, they were absolute rivals, and both trying to get claim to the sort of honorary title of being the heirs to Michelangelo in sculpture. So they're very competitive, and try to kill each other. And I mean, they're both really hot-headed people. But Leone wanted to outdo what Cellini had done with the Perseus by making a two-figure group like Cellini had done, but Leone's is larger. And extra bonus, you can actually take the suit of armor off, which was pretty shocking stuff. We don't know when the armor would have been taken off or put on, for that matter, if there was some sort of plan for how this would be used in work. But what Leone did here is show his capabilities in, obviously, in doing the new male figure, but also the ingenuity of coming up with a whole new kind of sculptural type that could be dressed and undressed with this whole suit of armor. It was really quite extraordinary. This sculpture also ends up in Spain. In fact, it's in the Prado, as is the bust of Charles V that we just saw. And it was absolutely revered and lauded throughout Europe for its ingenuity. Here, just to remind you of these comparisons, obviously there's some real important compositional similarities here. Perseus was completed in 1554. Leone is working on his Charles V right in that same period of time. And we just don't know exactly the timelines of them, but it's clear that that Leone is looking to the model of Perseus and Medusa by Cellini. He does some other portraits as well. This one of the Empress Isabella, the wife of Charles V. You can see that Leone is really invested in capturing the details of the hair, of the clothing, the jewelry that the figure wears. And it's clear that the Habsburgs really preferred Leone's style because he was, so good at capturing the just enough realism to capture the likeness of the person, but he sort of tempered it with some idealism because, especially in the portraits of Charles V, the flaws of Charles have been kind of tempered. He's not nearly as ugly as he was in real life, which we actually see recorded in other portraits. So Leone does very well with Charles V and with Philip II. And like Giulia Romano, Leone is given a house. This time it's a house in the center of Milan, very close to the cathedral. And it is an amazing house, truly. This is a two-storied building. This mezzanine level was added on later, so we just have to sort of ignore it. But you can see Leone conceived of a whole new facade type. It is really dynamic. You've got these large figures that lean over and kind of menace the passerby. And even in the interior, it was just an extraordinary house because it had this courtyard in it that was filled with sculpture. Leone was able to get copies and cast of different sculptures from Rome in particular. Like he had a copy of Michelangelo's Pietà, he had a copy of the Marcus Aurelius Equestrian Monument, and he put his own sculptures around with these sculptures of Michelangelo and of antiquity, showing this kind of line of succession from the great ancient sculptors through Michelangelo and then to Leone. He had an amazing art collection. Besides the sculptures, he had paintings by the greatest artists living in his day. It really was an extraordinary collection, including all of the known manuscripts by Leonardo da Vinci. He really was an incredible collector. Here's just some more details of the figures on the facade. I have written a book about Leone and this house, so it's hard for me to sort of limit my discussion of it, but I don't want to bore you with too much. But these are some of the paintings that Leone owned, including that Jupiter and Io painting that we saw previously by Correggio, and another painting from that same series of Danae. Correggio's Jupiter, Loves of Jupiter series was made and given to Gonzaga, and then Gonzaga gave it as a gift to Philip II, and Philip II gave it as a gift to Leone, who then had them in his house in Milan. He also owned these paintings by Parmigianino. Just an incredible collection. The other artist that becomes such an important player in Habsburg commissions is Titian. And really, Titian becomes the chief painter, whereas Leone is the chief sculptor. And in fact, contemporaries describe Titian as Charles V's Apelles and Leone as Charles V's Lysippus, thus mimicking the great artist and relationships of Alexander the Great. Of course, we came across Titian as we looked at some of his early works and talked about the Venus of Urbino, but Titian does portraits for Charles V as well, and this is a battle portrait. So we see the emperor on horseback. It obviously recalls the equestrian monument tradition, but again, Titian shows us what paint allows you to do that sculpture does not, and that is to fill the composition with beautiful color to give a sense of atmosphere and setting, and you get all of these beautiful effects of these contrasting textures of the horse's fur and the metal of the armor and so forth. This particular battle, the Battle of Mulberg, is one that we see commemorated in several portraits of Charles V, including the ones by Leone. He's wearing the same suit of armor that we see here. This battle was short-lived, but an important victory for Charles V in his battle against the Protestants, and he commemorated that in a number of commissions, as you can see here. Obviously, it recalls this Marcus Aurelius equestrian monument tradition, and just since I've just mentioned the Marcus Aurelius equestrian statue, this is the one that Leone had a copy of in his house. Once Philip took over, and even while Philip was still just a prince, Titian began working for him, and this is a picture of Philip II in armor. And with this portrait, Titian really starts this whole trend of standing full-length portraits of, and it's, you know, a kind of type that really sticks on for a long time throughout the Baroque period. We see the same kind of portrait type being employed. Like Leone, Titian understood well the requirements of his patrons to have portraits that would record their likeness without going too far and showing their flaws. So there's just enough idealism so that the figures are attractive looking, because Philip too suffered from a great deal of physical issues that made him quite unattractive. Because of the inbreeding of the Habsburgs, these kinds of physical issues are passed down from generation to generation. For Philip II, Titian does a series of the Loves of Jupiter, a cycle like the Correggio cycle we've already talked about. These are beautiful representations of Titian's middle and later style. As his style becomes more and more painterly, a looser brush stroke, you really see the pigment being applied to the canvas. He's working more quickly. He's using even richer colors, trying out different sorts of lighting effects. The figure changes somewhat. His approach to the figure changes somewhat. And of course, this naturally would remind you of the Venus of Urbino, or of Michelangelo's figures of the Nudi from the Sistine, and we definitely think that there is a connection here, and that Titian had gone to Rome by this point and surely saw the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And there's even a story that Titian showed this painting of Danae to Michelangelo, who retorted that that Titian really needed to learn how to draw. The Florentines often denigrated Venetian painting because it lacked that kind of drawing basis that Florentine painting had. I'll talk about this more in a lecture on the Paragone, but that issue is important here. It becomes a kind of civic difference between the Florentines and the Venetians, the Florentines representing line and drawing, and the Venetians color. And Titian clearly celebrates this kind of Venetian approach to painting. And you can really see here the difference. So while he takes from Michelangelo the position maybe of the figure and other elements like that, he doesn't take that same sort of technical approach to it. Titian paints directly on the canvas. It's much more spontaneous, and he sees painting on the canvas as a way to express that the ingenuity of the artist, and not have it be sort of lost or tempered by going through a series of drawings before you actually start to paint. The Florentines viewed it in exactly the opposite way. This is another painting that is part of the same cycle for Philip II. This is The Rape of Europa, and it shows us again that really spontaneous approach to painting the canvas. You can see that it's much more broadly painted. It's what we would call painterly, and that you really see the application of the paint. It's not perfectly finished, where to such an extent that you don't see brushstroke. You know, he's celebrating the application of the paint and that kind of spontaneity and this gorgeous mix of colors that oil painting allows him to create. The Rape of Europa, like the painting of Danae that we just looked at, show this change in Titian's style, and I think comparing it with the Venus of Urbino makes that approach abundantly clear. All the lighting effects, the approach to the body, the kind of action involved in the painting, his desire to really communicate motion and emotion becomes a much bigger part of his work than in that earlier period. Just to clarify a little bit, in this cycle of the Loves of the Gods, here in the Rape of Europa, Jupiter has been transformed into a bull and carries off Europa, the woman, in that scene. Whereas here in Danae, and we saw the one by Correggio as well, Jupiter is transformed into a shower of gold, and the gold coins are falling from the sky, and you have this old maid who tries to run in and capture up what she can, probably to protect the virginity of her mistress here. But Danae looks up with this loving gaze, and obviously is opening up her legs to receive Jupiter. And you see the puppy here is included and seems to be perfectly okay with what's happening, much like what we see in the Venus of Urbino with the sleeping dog. Titian is an incredibly successful businessman, not only as this court artist for the Habsburgs, but he has hearty business of supplying paintings for local patrons, and he even has a lumber business. He was just a smart, active businessman who did particularly well. However, in 1576, there was a round of the plague that really hit Venice very hard and unfortunately took the life of both Titian and his son. And just right in the time that the plague was getting started, Titian had started to paint this painting of the Pietà, and it seems to be something that he was painting for his own memorial, for his own tomb. And we've seen already how Michelangelo was doing the same thing, that kind of awareness and preparation for death. We see the adult Christ here, of course, on the lap of his mother, Mary Magdalene. And I assume that this is Joseph, though I can't swear to that. And then you have these two figures here. This is a figure of Moses holding the tablets. This appears to be Veronica, perhaps. And then you have an angel here flying and holding up a torch. The torch is a symbol of life, and the spent torch is a symbol of death. You can see this continued reverence for Venetian tradition with the incorporation of this gold mosaic in the background. And I've always loved this painting because there's actually a little painting within the painting, and you have Titian and his son in this little votive painting praying to the Virgin Mary, who appears in the upper left-hand corner of the work. Another great painter that worked for the Habsburgs is Sofonisba Anguissola. Sofonisba began her career in Lombardy and was certainly in contact with and aware of Titian and his work, and also Leone and other major masters like Correggio that were working in the area in this period. Sofonisba is unusual, of course, because she's a woman that was very successful with her painting. And she kept a record of herself. She did created many self-portraits in the course of her life, which makes her quite similar to Titian, who did the same thing. Titian, we see here holding a paintbrush. He's got the chain that shows that he had been knighted, and in fact he was knighted, as was Leone, by Charles V. Sofonisba, we see here, this is early on in her career. She's still a young woman, and we see her painting. She's holding the mahl stick, which is how painters would balance their hands as they do detail work in particular. And you see she's painting an image of the Virgin and Child. Sofonisba looks out at the viewer, engages the viewer, which we've already talked about, how that kind of way of showing women changes in the 16th century, that they are become more active and more aware of the viewer. And this is especially important here as we see her actually active in the act of painting. People were anxious to see what Sofonisba looked like as she gained in fame, because it was hard for people to conceive that a woman would actually be able to paint. Had been a profession reserved for men, and it just, it was hard for them to even make sense of it. So they wanted to see images of her. And clearly in this image showing herself painting, she is making clear that she is in fact capable of painting. Sofonisba, does several of these self-portraits. Some of them are quite sweet. We see her writing Sofonisba Anguissola made this in 1554. And again, Titian, of course, was a painter she would have known well and was making many portraits like this. Here we see Titian really just as a nobleman. We don't see any references to his work as a painter, except that this is, of course, a self-portrait. And the same is true of Sofonisba, who shows herself dressed as a woman of the upper class and able to read and obviously to write, as was true of women of her social station. But of course, references to her as a painter are clear here as well, especially in her signature. Sofonisba is an international artist, and unlike Leone and Titian, she actually goes and travels and settles outside of Italy, at least for a while. She first goes to the court of France, and then from there travels with Elizabeth of Valois to Spain, and she's at the court of Spain for several years, producing especially portraits of Elizabeth and of some of the other women at court, and some of the men as well. Sofonisba's portrait style was very influential to Spanish artists who create royal portraits after this fact. I would also point out that you have here again the standing full-length portrait, which obviously emulates that portrait type that I showed you Titian had begun. Here's another image of Elizabeth of Valois. And we know that Sofonisba actually was there as a lady, sort of a lady in waiting of Elizabeth. So she ends up gaining this sort of role, official role at the court. And she taught Elizabeth how to paint, which is kind of an interesting thing as well. This, I think, is one of Sofonisba's most beautiful paintings. This is a portrait of Philip II's daughter, Catilina Michaela, This painting is also known as Lady with an Ermine, in reference to the fur around her, this jacket that she's got, this mantle she has on. But just a gorgeous painting. And Sofonisba, obviously, just incredibly talented in conveying texture and showing these beautiful facial features, gorgeous modeling of Catalina's face. This portrait is of Philip II, and it was done by Alonso Sanchez Coello, and I show it to you just to show you that Sofonisba painted a portrait like this, in fact, very much like this, and we think that she was instrumental in teaching Sanchez Coello this kind of portrait style that he ends up carrying on after she leaves Spain. Sofonisba, of course, is an interesting case to look at because she represents the possibilities for at least some women living in the Renaissance and really opens the doors for the next generation of women. Lavinia Fontana, another female painter from Bologna, also is quite successful. And then, of course, more famously, Artemisia Gentileschi will also become an internationally renowned artist during her lifetime, just a generation later. While we may have some idea about Philip II in particular as being this kind of rigid, difficult ruler, which in some ways he was, it is true that he really did give artists a great deal of opportunities and really valued the contributions of artists in help promoting his reign, and certainly in helping to record the likenesses of his family and have those sent around to the courts. He rewarded his artist very well. And, you know, he also collected a greater range of art than one might expect. Philip II's reputation as this sort of ruthless Catholic ruler is mostly fiction that comes as a result of British English writers in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries who were, you know, Protestants, and you know, there's a long-standing struggle between the Spanish and the English, and you know, they end up sort of painting this picture of Philip that's quite unfair and not historically accurate. And current scholars are really trying to work through and figure out what's truth and what's fiction in the reputation of Philip II. From an art historical standpoint, certainly we can say that he was a patron that was really well learned and had a, you know, this scope of interest beyond just religious painting. He wasn't just this fervent Catholic ruler that wouldn't tolerate any other sorts of subjects. We've seen already he had paintings of the Loves of Jupiter, for example. But of course, he's a major patron of religious work, both within Spain and even outside of Spain, as certainly he, like his father, saw himself as the defender of the Catholic faith, and that certainly was an important part of his reign and how he wanted to be recalled. That's it for now.